felt like if I could put you on the street, you wouldn't look away. You'd be able to see what was really transpiring. I guess I feel as a matter of principle that somebody's got to tell these important stories. And for whatever reason, it seems to be the thing that I get committed to.
Hey everybody, welcome to Rightbrainers, where we unpack the latest trends in technology and creativity through real stories of creative breakthroughs brought to you by Z by HP. In each episode, we'll dive inside the creative minds of the world's most innovative thinkers. I'm your host, Tito, a man on a mission to get his left brain to understand some of the biggest right brains out there. I am so excited to welcome Nonny de la Peña to the podcast this week, dubbed the Godmother of Virtual Reality. Nonny and I talk about everything from her creative journey to the implications of virtual reality on journalism, to empowering more creatives to share important stories. This is my interview with Nonny. Nonny, thanks for coming on the show.
I'm really happy to join you on the show. Thank you so much for considering bringing me along on this project.
Yeah, and I'm happy to have you. It's going to be great. You started as a field journalist and then you moved into documentary films. Can you tell me about that leap in your career, what it was like?
Yeah. So when you're working as a journalist, I think you're always considering how to make a story compelling, how to make it evocative for an audience. You know, my career always had kind of a mix of visual and text or storytelling. So for a while, living in Manhattan, trying to find a job as a journalist, I just really needed to move back into a visual field. So I became a documentary filmmaker, and I was working on a documentary called Unconstitutional about all the civil liberties issues post 9/11. And I did a big segment on Guantanamo Bay prison. You know, it really bothered me that the prison remained open. It bothers me today that we still have this blight on our supposed principles of fair trial and habeas corpus rights, et cetera. We built a virtual Gitmo because you couldn't go to the real one and people didn't know about it and it wasn't accessible, et cetera, et cetera. And after I made that project, I remember very, very well sitting in my garden and thinking, wow, this could be used for all kinds of journalism. And it was that moment that I realized that the idea of immersive journalism was a valid one and began to think about ways to pursue making more pieces.
So that was your aha moment in the garden. Like after you did that project, you were like, I think I can apply this to other forms of documentaries, concepts, stories, all that type of stuff.
Correct.
So was it a seamless transition for you because of the skills you'd built in reporting, or did it feel like a new adventure entirely? Going from documentary film into VR, having this aha moment, and then now moving into multiple?
It didn't really exist, right? So using the material I had, we built this VR piece and we put you in the body of a detainee in a stress position. You were literally looking in a mirror and you would see this detainee, and we had a breathing strap on, so you were breathing at the same rate as this mirror image. You would turn your head and the character in the mirror would turn their head and you'd look down and you'd see your knees. And, you know, we had people just sitting on a chair upright with their hands behind their back. In the VR headset, they'd look down and their knees would be up like a hunched position. But then we asked them afterwards, what was your body like when you went through that piece? And everybody reported that they were hunched over in a stress position and how terrifying it was for them. It was an extraordinary moment. By giving people this kind of visual representation of their body, they can think that they're in a whole different position in the real world. And that was a pretty extraordinary moment for me and led to the paper on, talks about immersive journalism and using virtual reality for first-person production of the news.
Speaking of immersive journalism, a lot of your pieces put the user or player into these positions of, when I was watching your behind the scenes of the video in Syria, when you put the person in the middle of a war, or the person who had a diabetic insulin attack. It's like such a stressful thing to watch. And it seems like a lot of those things that you're creating, like where do you get your inspiration from or ideas from that you're like, okay, I think this is going to work in VR and this is what I want to pursue?
I was working as a research fellow at USC, and the students were doing a web news piece on hunger in the Golden State. And I just felt like, even with the photographs and the videos, that people going hungry were, they were invisible. And I felt like if I could put you on the street, you wouldn't look away. You'd be able to see what was really transpiring. Children, particularly, in both hunger in LA and Syria and other these pieces are unduly affected by these situations. And I guess I feel as a matter of principle that somebody's got to tell these important stories. And for whatever reason, it seems to be the thing that I get committed to. And I'm lucky enough to continue to be given opportunities to work on important stories. We get to do some fun stuff too, but
Yeah. But that's the stuff that when I saw it hit me like emotionally. And then you talk about this thing, duality of presence, right? At the end of the day, you're sitting in a VR headset comfortably in a living room or wherever art installation this might be. When did you know this is an actual thing that people can experience and affect? Like, when did that moment hit that you saw that type of reaction?
I think when I finished that first piece in Barcelona and I realized that people express being in both places at once. And with hunger, I started collecting all this data. In a number of my pieces, I've got, some of it unpublished data of how people report their connections to the story and what their body was like. But I heard that repeatedly. Wow. I felt like I was here and like I was there too. And that ended up prompting me to come up with the term duality of presence. We have a number of vernacular now that I used for my PhD dissertation. Another one you might find interesting is the embodied edit. What does it mean to edit a story when the body's along for the ride, when the body itself is being transported from place to place? And I call that the embodied edit. We think of rhetoric as a persuasive argument. And if I'm trying to tell these important stories, how do I use not only a digital format, but also an embodied format in order to tell the rhetoric of this? For example, we did a very big piece on climate change that puts you on the side of a glacier when it's disappearing. It's a time lapse. So when you see this big glacier disappearing when you're standing next to it, it's a very different feeling than watching a video on a screen. There's a number of elements in that piece where I feel like we demystify the science in a way that only virtual reality could. For example, we did photogrammetry of an actual NASA plane, and then we modeled out and animated what he does when he's flying his plane is drop these big temperature probes into the ocean from the back of the plane, like next to the toilet. And who couldn't just take this probe and drop it down and measure temperature? Well, anybody could. So that really helps people go, oh, they're not just in some cubbyhole making stuff up. So I think that embodied thing is special in terms of conveying knowledge.
Embodied digital rhetoric, does that mean like for this iceberg example you gave, is that maybe somebody who is right-leaning or doesn't believe in climate change, they take on this experience and then it's a way to persuade them that climate change is an actual thing?
If you're going to make an argument like the oceans are warming and the glaciers are melting, let's make it in an embodied form. And the most powerful message certainly came through the full embodied, sixed off, volumetric piece. I've had a lot of these pieces get studied either by me or by other organizations that I've lent the material to in order to kind of analyze the effectiveness of the material and compare it to traditional media. And, it's kind of in its own category for people's connection to the story.
With regards to like VR and 3D, could you educate me a little bit? There's VR, AR, XR, mixed reality. Are you working and using all of these in your projects?
I absolutely am. Absolutely. Because I think what all of those have in common is that you're dealing with a dimensionalized space. Each one of those categories actually have a very central unifying theme, and they're dealing with spatial content. They're dealing with dimensionalized content. They're representing our real world in some way as it actually is with full dimension. And I think XR becomes sort of the ability to try to unify everything.
What is the process of putting people inside one of these immersive stories? How do you plan for that?
The number one thing I always tell people when they're going to start a VR piece, and I think AR, this is true too, but close your eyes and imagine your body in the space. And from there, you can begin to think about, well, where is the story going to happen around me? Where's the sound going to happen around me? If I were there, how would things unfold around me? And I think that's a really different thing because we're so used to like thinking of the audience in a seat. And how are you going to push the visuals, around so that they're in a seat and perceiving them with a fixed gaze in this square box? And that is just not the case with VR. You have to be inclusive of the body. We know that people take their body along to the movie theater. They will jump, if something scary happens. I mean, your body's along for the ride wherever you go. But nothing like with VR, when you're completely immersed in a story and been taken to another place, and you have that duality of presence where you're here, but you feel like you're there at the same time. And I think understanding that you've got to construct a story where the body's at the center is really still a new concept for a lot of creators, but it's super fun, and if you're creative, it's just a super fun new place to play.
Yeah. And once you've pre-visualized it in your head and you have an idea of where you want to go with this, how many people does it take to accomplish that? And who do you collaborate with? And what's the next steps?
Always depends on the story, right? Are you doing a huge sci-fi blockbuster or are you doing a really intimate story? If I'm going to do journalism, I really try very hard to do photogrammetry of real environments, of putting in real places. That's been a little bit more of a challenge because of COVID. So I've had to work around some things.
And photogrammetry, that is making an environment digital?
It's more than making environment digital, it's making environment spatial. Simple way of photogrammetry is you literally go out with your camera and you take a gazillion pictures of a place. And you have to be thinking, oh, I want every inch of this space painted in red. Well, how would you do that? You'd have to paint underneath the table. You'd have to paint the chair legs. You'd have to paint the ceiling. You'd have to paint every corner, right? And it's the same thing with photogrammetry. You've got to photograph every inch if you want to be able to represent it digitally, right? So photogrammetry really, back when I did Hunger in LA and I had to do everything in CG and I had no budget, but now the ability to do things with photogrammetry is super exciting that you can really go places. I've been working on a piece with the Japanese American National Museum on a teenage boy who was pulled from his home during World War II with his family and put in a Japanese American concentration camp in Wyoming. And he was this incredible thinker and artist. And we've done photogrammetry of Heart Mountain. And so you're in one of the barracks, a replica of what he lived in. And we're animating his drawings with quill. But 10 days before the war, we extracted these young men from these camps while their families were still locked up and sent them to the very worst front lines of the war in World War II. So Stanley was drafted from Heart Mountain. And 10 days before the war ended, he actually left his position of safety to try and rescue a friend and was killed. His grave is in LA, but in order to do photogrammetry, they had some limitations so he could go. So I haven't been to his grave. And one of my colleagues here was like, it's okay. You're going to be able to stand there in a few minutes when we get the photogrammetry back. But one of the things about Stanley Hayami is in his diary, he always wrote about going home to San Gabriel. He wanted to go home to San Gabriel. When he died, I'm sure the military must have paid for his gravestone. And it said he was from Wyoming, which is actually the concentration camp location, right? Heart Mountain. So I'm going to be able to do photogrammetry of his grave. And I'm going to be able to change the word Wyoming to read San Gabriel. So I'm going to be able to bring Stanley home and, be able to stand at his grave and see it. Maybe in VR, but I'll feel like I'm standing at his grave and get to see him back home.
With photogrammetry, what I have seen, objects and static things and inanimate objects, they look really good. But then as soon as it gets to the human face, you start crossing that uncanny valley type thing, right? And it starts looking a little deformed.
I have a whole theory about the uncanny valley. In fact, I don't believe in the uncanny valley, just to be controversial.
Stuff looks kind of weird.
I call it behavioral realism.
What does that mean?
So if something behaves in a way that doesn't screw with your eye, with what you know is true in the physical world, and I don't mean the way something looks, I mean the way that it behaves, it's got a believability to it. That's not a problem. So let me explain. When I did Project Syria, right, which puts you on the street in Aleppo when a bomb goes off, I tried really hard to model the little girl who's singing when the bomb goes off. Once again, I had no money and it just looks awful. Her eyes look really weird. She just looks like anybody's definition of uncanny valley, looking at an image, that's the way it is. However, interestingly enough, if you put on a headset and you did the 360 version of it, which we made, the 360 video in which you couldn't move around, suddenly the whole thing felt awful. Just totally bad CG, disconnecting, etc. But when you were in there in a 6-stop room scale, full body where everything's kind of happening around you, and there are little nuances like making sure the wheels on the tires of the cars go around, or that you don't see when people's feet maybe clip into the sidewalk. Like I would put garbage bag models in front of where their feet would walk to cover bad stuff like that. There was no sensation of the uncanny valley. And if you go and look into the deeper research about this, the uncanny valley was always about, a real rubber hand being totally freaky. It wasn't really meant to be about somebody in an experience that was dimensionalized. So I think we need to separate the two. And I actually that's the kind of evidence I have that I believe, things can look terrible, but if you can make the story work around them in a way that, doesn't really, nobody's floating in the air, or, that there's a certain natural behavior that the characters and the scenes depict, that you can avoid the sensations of the uncanny valley.
But speaking of production things, just going back to your process, I'm really interested in knowing like what kind of software does it take to build out these stories and what kind of hardware. People in the podcast can't see that you're actually sitting in front of a bunch of different headsets. And from what I understand, some of them that you 3D printed and created and worked on. So I'm interested to understand that side of things.
So when I went to Sundance with Hunger in LA as the first VR piece, I was working out of a lab at USC. But at that time, we only had like this $50,000 headset in the lab. And when the piece got into Sundance, the head of the lab, Mark, was like, you can't take that anywhere. So there was this kid kicking around who was like the lab intern. He was totally obsessed with goggles. And he ended up making 2 pairs to take with us. The night that they were leaving for Sundance, the day, it was meant to leave at 10 in the morning, I wouldn't let them get on the truck. And believe me, the goggles, because I was still experiencing some nausea and we had more coding to do to try to get rid of the distortion. And, I have a very narrow face and this kid had a fat head. And so we had very different IPDs, as they say, where your pupils. So there was a lot of at the last minute, but it got on the truck at about 10 at night to go to Utah. And this kid ended up crashing my hotel room and driving the truck and driving us around Sundance like an intern.
That's got to be a crazy story just in itself. Sorry to sidetrack. Just like, whoa, working on this, hanging out. And then it's just that journey in life has got to be insane to look back on it.
There were a lot of people involved in the project. That was 2010. So once I made Hunger, well, it was 2012, right? So during the period of time that Hunger started, actually, that was the worst fall for me almost in my life, because when I made Hunger, the head of the journalism school left at the end of that year, and the dean thought what I was doing was crazy and didn't renew my fellowship. And my husband was being forced to furlough during the California economic downturn. And, I ended up one night where I had enough money to buy food for my kids, but I didn't have enough money to even feed myself. Our piano teacher, who didn't get paid for a year, actually took me out for dinner.
Yeah. That's just where you were in life. I get it.
And the goggles we had were falling apart, and somebody took them apart and couldn't put them back together again. I had to start making my own goggles. So I had to source the lenses we'd been using from this amazing guy who was providing lenses for NASA, but he went bankrupt. So I had to source the guy who bought the company out of bankruptcy and get lenses from him. So then we started 3D printing my own goggles because there was nothing out there to let me walk around in. But as soon as other goggles started coming out where I was not responsible for the gear, and I had to use $100,000 tracking equipment in order to let them walk around. I mean, I picked it up at a bankruptcy sale for $7,000, right? So, I was always scrappy.
That's very resourceful.
Yeah, always scrappy. I'm still scrappy.
What are you using currently to create content?
In terms of game engine content, we've been using basically Unity and Unreal all the way through. Now we do a lot of videogrammetry of characters, and I've been lucky enough to work with 8i before they went bankrupt, with Metastage. We've been playing a little with some 40 views. There's some really interesting new players coming into that space. DepthKit. We also have to use fast processing computers. I have my HP computer over there. So I need the kind of gear that, HP puts out. And I cannot tell you how I am just so excited that there'll be some new goggles coming out soon. I'm really looking forward to trying the Reverb.
Yeah, I've heard about those too. So
it's amazing to me the number of goggles that are out there and how good they've become and the ease of use. And I feel very lucky. You have to have a gaming computer and you need fast processing. HP is one of the most important players in the game.
So let's talk about your company, Emblematic. How did you guys decide that your next move would be to create a platform like Reach?
In order for me to make Hunger, because again, there's a lot of people telling me I couldn't do it, I couldn't make it work. I got a lot of help, but I had to become a better C# coder. And then when our Guantanamo Bay project, the Gitmo project I made in Second Life, it was invited to be shown at the Moscow Museum of Modern Art, then I really needed to learn better coding. And it was really hard. And to this day, I think about things like null reference exception, which was just simply that in the Unity side, you put a small letter E, and in the C# side, you put a capital letter E, and it couldn't find the file because one was a small letter and one was a capital letter. And also, I'm lucky enough that I have access to this incredible gear, and there's a lot of people who've supported me and give me free equipment, et cetera. But this is a really interesting moment where we have an opportunity in this nascent field where we're creating things with depth in the XR field, it's going to be a really important part of the future. The way we do media, sports, news, entertainment, no doubt, right? Of course, games. But I really want to democratize the ability to make volumetric content.
Volumetric content. That's a new word. What is that?
Volumetric content. That means content that's got dimension, spatial content you can walk through, right?
Okay.
I use the word volumetric all the time. It's like an old term, and I don't, we're still getting the vernacular right.
Yeah. I'm learning.
You know what? I think dimensionalized gets like a no-no from your spell check. But anyway, so the point of Reach was to try to throw out the way that the game engines require a lot of engineering skills and a real depth of knowledge, and make it a lot easier for people to start entry level, mostly to begin making volumetric content that can be easily made with buttons and then distributed widely. When you publish a Reach piece, it publishes as just like a regular URL, like you would a website, and you can embed it just like you can embed a YouTube video straight in the browser. So you can look at it in the browser, you can look at it in a headset, you can look at it on your phone, and you can just make it using unbelievable libraries we have now of objects. So I know that this story, once we move the whole piece into WebXR, right? That's really the term you want to be thinking about, WebXR, which means that you can put it in the web and you can also watch it on a headset or whatever. That is what Reach is. It's a WebXR focused platform, which is button-based interface, and that you can publish across anything and easily. So we had
So is Reach kind of like the Squarespace of creating virtual environments?
Reach.love is like the Squarespace of creating virtual reality, because it lets you not only use environments, whether they're digital or whether they're photogrammetry, but you can put characters in there too. And you can put in video, you can put in a depth kit character, you can put in a volumetric character, videogrammetry. So I'm kind of proud of it. We have a lot of things working in the background that are going to be made more forward-facing this summer, including timelines. And it's just, if you wanted to put stuff up on Steam, for example, you have to have a 2D video. And it drove me crazy for that same uncanny valley reason we discussed earlier. I'd have to put an ugly CG into Steam on a 2D, and I'd have to take a lot of time to try to make a good trailer for something that should never be in 2D. And it made me crazy. Then also, when I put Project Siri up on Steam, I got all this hate, horrible trolling, animosity, vitriol leveled at me and the project and the story ideas. And then, so who wants it to go there? And so Reach had all these things. I could put a trailer up that's actually volumetric. I can embed it in a website, in the website of my choosing, so I have control where it goes and who the audience might be who's going to receive it. And these are all really important factors. And right now, when we need to be able to give the opportunities to underserved communities so that this technology doesn't leave them out the way, much of the original technology has, I think that something like Reach could hopefully be helpful.
Why was it important to you that Reach be collaborative?
I know how hard my journey was, right? And I know all the different obstacles. And I just don't really want to be the only woman. I don't want to be the only Latina. I don't want to be, I feel like there's so many talented people out there, and I want their stories to be told too. This is part of who I am, is this idea that I want to give back, given all the wonderful opportunities I've had. But I would like to make it so that this new medium, which is going to become huge, is something that's accessible for everyone.
Yeah, let's make it more accessible too.
That's the whole point. Reach.love is extremely accessible. It's just button-based. It's the Canva, the Squarespace, right? Super easy system that anybody can create and publish their own stories. You can literally right now make stuff without having to build anything other than grabbing from different libraries and maybe shoot yourself in front of a green screen or a blue screener. It really does offer a way for anybody to start participating in what I think will be our volumetric future.
Totally. Volumetric futures. Can you talk about the accessibility to VR and how it could have the power to change how we currently see the world, and why accessibility is important to you?
There's been a lot of pushback on the idea that VR is a particularly strong medium for empathy. And I understood why you can't really say it's an empathy machine, because the technology isn't necessarily like it's a magic wand and you just make a story in VR and suddenly people connect to other stories, places, and people. But I do think that there's nothing like being in a real scene, like if you witness something yourself, the way that you feel about it is very different than anybody who hears you talk about it is going to feel. And I think that that's one thing that is special about this medium, that it gives an ability to access important stories. And one of the goals for me is giving people the ability to tell their own stories and connect in this full embodied form that is super unique to this medium.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
The other thing about going to a virtual environment as well is that it does offer ways for folks who may not be able to leave their room, right? You might be able to have a piece that's really mostly built on spatial audio. So it does offer accessibility even to people with limited ability to, interact in the virtual world with movement or controllers, right? There's something there that's really special. And I think that that's something that people can go places they couldn't go through the medium. So it's just an extraordinary realm in which to start to tell a story, but also I really want to make sure that people from all different kinds of communities can participate in what I think will be a really important medium for how we communicate in the future.
Yeah. With VR, I've had a couple experiences, right? With gaming, entertainment. I've even taken a VR and ridden on a roller coaster. I've never heard of immersive journalism before, this conversation with you and bringing it in. But this is something that I could totally see as an introduction to VR, like going to my mom, who's not very technologically savvy, and being like, hey, Mom, try this out. Check what it's like to be in Aleppo, Syria. See what this experience is like for this person in the LGBTQ community. All these things which I've never thought of before. And it's just pretty fascinating to see this is the direction that it's going in. And this is the type of content that can be created.
It's a funny idea sometimes for me too, honestly. When I came up with the term immersive journalism way back when, I had a lot of my colleagues pointing their finger in my face. This will never work.
Well, the idea is crazy. I mean, if you look at it from the outside, what, you want to bring journalism into VR? This is a kid's thing. This is a game thing. This isn't for that. But when you see that experience for the first, when I saw a couple of your examples of your video, I was like, my heart was beating a little faster. And I can only imagine what it's like once I get a headset of trying out one of these experiences, what it'll be like.
They work. There's no doubt about it. And immersive journalism is now embraced as an avenue for journalists to pursue. It's kind of amazing to me that has occurred, but that indeed is the case. And the New York Times calls it immersive journalism. It is a avenue for journalists to consider when they're making content. It still requires the same, what I call boots on the ground efforts, the same kind of research, the same sort of working, the same sort of thinking through. How do you pick the right stories? Then how do you convey information? I've been really struggling. We're pretty close. We've got one piece that I'm really not yet happy with, but been working on a piece about Lyme disease, about a woman who died because she didn't get enough antibiotics due to being cut off by her insurance company. And her story is extraordinary, but the testing and the failure of the testing with Lyme disease is extremely difficult to convey. It's a very kind of dry and clinical piece, and other parts of it are very intense and emotional. So, I'm not saying I have all the answers yet to how we tell these stories, but for an unfolding event where something's happening, unfolding around you, wow, it's really effective. And I think, it's going to get better and better with understanding medical things. We've learned for training, it's so effective. And if training works, that's nonfiction. And that's exactly what I'm working on with immersive journalism.
Curiosity is getting to me. You've had a lot of successes and a lot of projects that you've worked on, but a couple of them have failed or they didn't turn out the way that you thought that they would. What was that failure and how did you learn from it?
Well, that's funny because you built this entire section and it is so well rendered and made in this Lyme disease project where you literally go through looking at antibodies and Lyme antigens and, terms we've all been hearing about COVID. And you're in the lab and you see the different processes and how you separate out things by, their weight and blah, blah, blah. But it is so dry and boring to be in it. I can't even believe how bad it is. So I have to throw the whole thing out, which man, is that expensive and difficult. But I need to do it. It's not right. And I have to say, I'm not really the biggest advocate of self-help books. It's just not really my nature. But, when I read Creativity and how Pixar would have to throw stuff out, it sure made me feel a lot better. Sometimes making stuff, you're going to fail and you're going to make the wrong thing. And especially even harder in a medium that is still so nascent and that we are inventing as we go along. But in the end, the pieces work. That's also up to the maker to hold themselves to a standard to make sure that it's effective, because there's plenty of bad stuff of any kind out there. It wouldn't be the first time that I felt like things didn't work, but then there's some things that I've made that were just so rudimentary in their CG nature, but are really powerful.
It's interesting that to a degree you play God, right? You're in VR, you can make and do anything that you want. but you seem to chase a lot of social justice topics. Is that from your journalist side?
I have made a really wide variety of stories. And I used to be told like that some of the stories I wanted to pursue, hunger, Syrian refugees, LGBTQ homelessness, domestic violence. In between I've done, Lime and Cartier and a Formula One piece. And, I've done a pretty wide variety of pieces. But the ones that make people feel something, the term that was often thrown at me was, you're doing advocacy journalism. And I think we have to stop and reflect and say, what are those stories? Are they stories that are, advocating for social justice, or are they important journalistic pieces that I happen to decide would convey something very important and more viscerally if I did it in VR? So there's my slight comment about that. It was interesting because it started with, you can't do VR in journalism. Oh, you're an advocate. You're doing advocacy journalism. On and on until, today, where it feels like people are going, yeah, immersive journalism, that's a thing. And I'm thrilled to see that as cost comes down, most newsrooms can adopt it as a form of telling stories.
Like if people are going to tell you, oh, immersive journalism, VR, like obviously you've been making it happen and doing it. So that's awesome.
I blame it on my father in some ways. When I was in junior high school, I had this math teacher that I didn't think was that smart. I mean, I know in junior high, you're not meant to think your teacher's not that smart, but I did. And clearly I was a bit of a pain. And I came home with like a note from her, as they used to do in the old days, with a note, that the parent had to sign, that they'd seen you'd done, were in trouble.
Troublemaker Nonny.
And my dad flipped it over the other side and said, Nonny tells me you do this, that, and the other, and sent it back to school with me. So talk about supporting the idea that, you don't have to accept the status quo or the authority. And, I was coming home with excellent grades they have now, but they would give you a grade and then a work habits and a cooperation. Those were the things, right? And I would come home with straight AUUs because I was always challenging the teachers. And it's true, I had to go start my own company because there were just so few women in tech. And unfortunately, that means that you get a lot of pushback in multiple different ways, right? From, what people might say to you that under current scenarios would be less acceptable. But I had to take a lot of that. And if I wanted to get access to the equipment or to labs or, places to work, I had to just keep my mouth shut so I could do my work. And then I moved off campus and then I moved here with my own lab. And, it's a struggle sometimes. But I think we continue to be one of the most innovative companies out there. And I think Reach.love is going to really help change the world. And I sure hope so. I sure hope it means that lots of thinkers and creators and artists and makers are able to participate in this extraordinary medium without hindrance. That's really the goal.
So if you wanted listeners to take away one thing from this episode, what would that be?
So actually being kind to people really can help heal. And I think this is a moment where, in particular, we have a lot of healing we need to do, right? We've got a lot of people really suffering. And we're going to see that further with economic issues, obviously with COVID, the way that we're facing the racism that has permeated this nation. I think that there's a lot of people in pain. And this is an extraordinary moment for us to think about how do we help each other heal. And I know it's not about VR, but it's what I believe.
Yeah, kindness does cure. Kindness does cure. And hopefully with all these experiences that you're making, you're showing some intense subjects, but hopefully it brings realization to people. And then in turn, they're kind to others. So I think it kind of brings it full circle. It's beautiful.
We have seen the pieces have an effect on the way people say that they're going to proceed, right? You're not going to be able to change everybody or, anybody that you want to. But, the piece that we did in which we put you on scene, so you understand the kind of vitriol and horribleness that young women suffer when they're standing to get into health clinics as they go past the doors. And the things that are yelled at them is just really brutal. And after we've taken that and studied in a number of very conservative communities, and the piece in no way is saying you should have a view about abortion or anti-abortion. The piece is just saying young women shouldn't be treated that way. And pretty much everybody's gone through the piece say that their views were shifted and that they would actually even vote on candidates who would help prevent young women from being treated that way. That is a win-win, right? And that piece very much...
Yeah, that's a definite win-win.
But think of investigative journalism. Investigative journalism almost always is about an issue that needs to be uncovered and remedied. And I think that most of my pieces really or like the investigative journalism pieces I did as a documentary filmmaker, as a journalist, they're very similar. There are usually issues that need to be uncovered, experienced, and remedied.
Nonny, thank you so much. And hopefully, if I'm ever in your neck of the woods, we can go and indulge in some food or drinks or something somewhere.
You know it.
Hang out.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Up next on the show, we'll invite a true expert in all things AR, VR, MR, XR, all the Rs, to pull back the curtain on some of the complicated stuff Nonny and I just geeked out on. I'm excited to welcome HP's global head of virtual reality, the brilliant Joanna Popper. Welcome, Joanna.
Great to be here, Tito.
So we had a great conversation with Nonny, lots of questions. You're the expert. You're the one I come to for anything VR, XR, AR, MR, all the R-related stuff. Nonny's creative journey has focused on democratizing volumetric content. What does that mean? That anybody can create these experiences?
So Nonny's had an amazing career. And I mean, she is known as the godmother of virtual reality, right? So she was at USC. I think they had to create a headset because at that point, there was not yet a commercially available headset. She brought the first virtual reality experience to the Sundance Film Festival. And she's done so much groundbreaking work. She's taken on so many really important topics, then created content about what is it like to be in solitary confinement in a prison. She's done content about, what is the experience of somebody who is, going to a reproductive center and having people yell at them about their choices. She's an immersive journalist. She has a filmmaking background, she has a journalism background, and she uses new technology and innovation to bring us inside stories, to have us understand and relate to and connect to other people's life experiences in a new way.
A lot of her stuff, I was like, oh man, this is some heavy content that you're putting out, right? But really quite fascinating and a way of, I think, bringing people to VR to show them like, hey, it can be more than just games. It can be doing stuff, social justice types issues.
Exactly. And so, to answer your question specifically on, how is she democratizing? She created a platform called Reach, which is a web browser for virtual reality. So having it be accessible on the web means that you can access it already on your computer, on your phone. And so you don't necessarily need all the virtual reality technology to work with it. And so her platform Reach, you're able to take assets and drop them in to the backgrounds that she's captured. And it makes it a lot easier for people without very deep technical skills to create in virtual reality. And so that's how her platform Reach is democratizing the content creation.
To get the full experience of these types of experiences that Nonny has created, what type of hardware do you need?
Well, as we talked about, to access Reach, it's web VR, so you can access it on a browser, on your phone, on your desktop. But to have the full experience and be inside, face to face with the content, and you really have the full immersive experience, I would still recommend seeing it inside a virtual reality headset like the HP Reverb G2, and then connect it to a VR backpack or laptop or desktop for your full experience.
Yeah. But like something simpler than that, could you use just a mobile phone with the VR experience, like in a cardboard type thing?
You could go into the Reach browser and you can view some of for work on your desktop or on any browser.
Cool. Can you help us further understand what volumetric content is?
Sure. So volumetric content is the footage of a real person that's captured from various camera angles and then, put through a software that analyze, compress, and recreate all those viewpoints to give you a fully volumetric or 3D human or model. And so what that means is that, volumetric capture of you would be a 3D version of you. And you could take that and drop that into a game or a virtual reality set. You could, have the Tito game. And Tito could be doing all sorts of cool things that had been captured, from content creation.
Do you need a ton of cameras all rigged up? Like, can you do it at home, or do you have to have a special setup for this type of thing?
Can you do it at home? Probably not, unless you have all of the technology. But what Nonny is creating is making it easier to take the volumetric capture and have it be done on WebXR and then drop it in. And so that just makes it much more accessible for people.
How does photogrammetry contribute to volumetric content?
So photogrammetry is a technique of processing still images that would produce high resolution 3D mesh. So you can do it by taking photos of the subject in real life, running them through photogrammetry software mesh, capture the images, you produce reference points, connect the dots, and give this whole intricate framework to then construct game engine ready environments. So why is that important for VR? You can then, use the photogrammetry models to empower audiences to virtually explore locations, objects, people via headset and a browser.
Just so I understand, is photogrammetry to photography, still objects, and then volumetric content is to video, motion, moving, capturing, all that type of stuff?
Yeah, volumetric would be. You could do it as a still, or you could do it as a moving object for volumetric.
Nonny talked about the use of XR. Can you explain this a little more and how Nonny uses WebXR to further unify and democratize the experience?
Nonny is using the Reach platform that she created. And so it simplifies the authorship and the distribution of virtual reality experiences. So the idea is you use a simple drag and drop interface that anyone can access from any device, a laptop, a tablet, or a smartphone. Her idea is that it makes it really simple for people to make volumetric content. So I talked earlier about, in many cases, people go to someplace like the Intel volumetric stage, or you go to the Meta stage and make volumetric content that still would take a sizable investment. But with Reach, the idea is that the platform creates environments and lets users drag and drop footage of themselves, audio, text, 3D objects into the scene. And that helps make it available to almost anyone. You don't even need a headset to view it. You can use it on browsers. It very much democratizes that. You don't need all of the cameras and all of the tools for what we see of a lot of volumetric content.
What kind of hardware is needed to convey the emotion of impact on VR stories? And here's the thing. So, in the VR things, you have the avatars, right? They're kind of like just moving. There's not a lot of emotion. It's not like watching the movie Avatar where, they have emotions and all that type of stuff. So in the future, would that be like volumetric, some type of device, volumetric content that is capturing the face so that it conveys on the avatar in the VR world? Does any hardware exist now? Is this where are we headed?
Those are great questions. So today, you're right. They don't really have expressions. When you're in a virtual world, the social VR experience, the way that a lot of the platforms have got around this is they create emojis. And so you use emojis. And so you'd see my avatar, but then you see hearts coming up, you see clapping coming up. You might see me doing backflips or dancing. That's the way to create the expression. But you don't see my smile, you don't see my eyes light up as an avatar. But companies are working on that. Companies are working on biometric tools to capture, eye tracking, facial expression. There's lots of different companies working on that to create the ability to capture emotion or capture expression of the avatars. There's definitely lots of work in progress on that.
Fantastic. Joanna, thank you so much. You're the best. I always appreciate it when you're on here.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Good to talk to you too. A big thank you to this week's guest, the godmother of VR, inventor of new fields, first of her name, Nonny de la Peña. Find her on Twitter at Immersive Journal. And be sure to visit beta.reach.love to sign up for early access as a beta user on the platform. Rightbrainers is brought to you by Z/HP, the makers of high-performance laptops, desktops, and solutions for technical and creative pros. Well, that's a wrap on this episode. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want more food for your right brain, visit www.hp.com/rightbrainers. Until next time, I'm Tito Hamzy, and this is Rightbrainers.